Hello, everybody. Nice to welcome you again after a 2-week break to today's episode of When I Feel. This will be our last episode before the, let's say, call it summer break, although this year it's a little bit of an unusual summer break, but I'm happy you joined me again today. It's the first time I'm doing this video from home, and it's the first time I'm home in many, many months. Back in Berlin, I spent most of our, let's say, crisis time in Munich, and now I'm back here in my living room, let's say home base, and it's quite fitting to do this last episode here, because today I'd like to somehow summarize this whole series, where we started, where we are, and wish you all a great summer. And it's a perfect setting to do that now, being home for the first time. And interestingly, when I first planned this series, which was actually before the whole Corona crisis happened, I always intended to have the last episode be on Mahler's Ninth Symphony, which was throughout my entire life for me the probably most important piece of music that for me, and the music that has meant most to me in my life. Although of course superlatives are tricky to use in this context, but it was always a very, very important for me. And the word or the feeling that I thought of initially, I thought, what can you attach to Mahler's Ninth Symphony that does not, because any specific feeling will just describe one of its so many facets, of its so many aspects, of its so many characteristics. And I thought the one probably most, I would say, basic fundamental idea that I think of when I think of this piece is the word incomplete, because in a way it's so a piece of music so close to perfection, so close to complete spiritual transcendence, that you could say that's the moment where you realize that it doesn't matter how far you go with an artistic experience, this is, so to say, the limit, and you feel your own incompleteness at grasping that experience. And at the same time also incomplete, because it's about farewell, and farewell is always about missing something. And so we started out this series at the time, and the plan was every time to recommend a different recording, to listen to a specific piece, and which I associate with a specific feeling. And today I'd like to take that into a, let's say, slightly larger approach, and not just talk about Mahler's Ninth and about incompleteness, but also a few thoughts about what we've been through together these last few months. And we've all been through these last few months in different ways. And do not worry, I'm not going to do another political Corona speech today, for there's enough people that do that. But just a little bit of looking backwards on this series that started as a pre-Corona idea and ended up becoming a regular weekly event for me, and for those of you who've been so loyal to follow me ever since. And for me, the last three symphonies of Mahler that have always been, I would say, my spiritual home in many ways were, I would say the Lied von der Erde, which is for me basically a symphony, even though you could call it a song cycle. The Ninth Symphony being part 2 of this trilogy, and the 10th Symphony. Those three pieces have comprised for me my musical home for most of my life, still since I remember discovering these pieces for the first time. And I've spent years and years working on my own version of the 10th Symphony, so that's obvious for what reason it's become so close to me. But the main connection I see between those three pieces is the fact that all three of them depict some form of farewell. And I don't mean this in a programmatic sense. I think with Mahler, one should be very careful. There is so many tendencies, or let's say a great tradition in let's say adding or attaching biographical, or let's say programmatic content to Mahler's symphonies, and he himself rejected that idea. And I'd really like to avoid that, because it's not just about whether he intended to write a piece about something. It's about whether we as interpreters or as listeners feel that there is a certain subject that helps us reach a place of deeper understanding through this music. As far as I'm concerned, if one as a conductor, as a player, as a listener, finds a key, a tool that helps us, let's say, reach a greater state of let's say spiritual awareness or musical awareness when we conduct, play, or listen to a piece of music, it doesn't really matter if it's what the composer intended or thought of, which we'll never know anyway. It's about what helps us and get closer to the piece, and through that closer to ourselves. So this construction is something that I believe in, and I would say that I can imagine that this is something that Mahler, at least in some way, was involved with, because the topic of farewell was relevant for his life. I don't think he necessarily thought of those 3 symphonies as, oh, I'm going to write 3 symphonies on farewell. Quite frankly, I'm pretty sure he did not even think he's going to complete those 3 symphonies when he started them. But for me, when I think about it from that point of view, it gives me a general idea, or let's say a general intensity or background of what context those pieces are to be seen in, and therefore it guides me in all interpretational decisions. So perhaps when you listen to the music, it gives you a similar help or guidance. The first one of the 3, the Lied von der Erde, Song of the Earth, for me was the first step of Mahler's, let's say, interest would be wrong because he said it his whole life, but direct, intense work on the topic of farewell and of death. I mean, the topic of death was incredibly deeply rooted in his life since his childhood, and also in his music all throughout his life. But in the case of the Lied von der Erde, you could really feel that it's the first time he is, in a way, trying to figure out his own mortality. And it's very much a piece about one's own physical death. For me, it's death literally in the sense of a person dreading the moment of death, a moment of saying goodbye to life as a body. And I think you can interpret that the piece that he wrote shortly after he found out about his diagnosis, although we know now that it wasn't so much about his own health, that is because his health was shaky for years already, but it was a point where accumulation of many, many forms of death in his life, whether it was his daughter, his own health, his siblings. For me, it's not about any of that. It's about the point where he has achieved everything he wanted to achieve in his compositions. The 8th Symphony was for him the climax of his work. And I have the feeling that this was where he turned to some sort of a summary. Having said all that, I think it is completely irrelevant whether it was his plan or not. For me, this is a symphony that starts with, or let's say song cycle, with the most vital movement he ever wrote, with the first Stringliede Jammer der Erde, and goes all the way to the last movement, which is actually called Der Abschied, the farewell, where I feel he is in a way confronted what mortality means in the most direct and naked form that I know, and somehow created this journey of acceptance. I mean, Mahler always goes from anger on a verdict or on a certain destiny and then through acceptance as some sort of transcendence to letting go, and therefore reaching a higher form of let's say enlightenment in a way. And with the last movement, which is the longest of the 6 and also one of the longest movements he ever wrote, it's almost a process of constant struggle, and therefore in a way losing the struggle, but through accepting that you've lost it, also in a way winning it because you've let go. And at the end we have the word ewig, ewig, so eternal, eternal, that comes back again and again and again in a way. And it's with the celesta and with the harp, the movement disappears into some really a form of transcendental, you can imagine a person going through the horizon into a different world. The 9th Symphony, which came right afterwards. I mean, we know that he did not call the Lied von der Erde Symphony number 9 because he was afraid of the curse of the 9th Symphony. So many other composers died after they wrote the 9th Symphony, so he preferred to give it a different name. But in a way, it was planned as his 9th Symphony. The 9th, though, the real 9th, he wrote, and similar to the Lied von der Erde, he never performed any of those pieces during his lifetime. And for Mahler, the process of composition was so inherent to the process of performance was so inherent to the process of composition, because he changed and retouched so many of his pieces after he performed them and premiered them for the first time, and changed the orchestration and changed so many ideas. All of those pieces were written in their one fair copy form. Of course, the 10th, not even that. I mean, it was unfinished, and then left for posterity to deal with and to interpret and to think about. And the 9th is for me the next step of farewell. It's the farewell to saying farewell to the spirit. It's not anymore about your body. It's not anymore about your own death as just as a living being. It's about the death of your spirit. It's about whether your spirit and your soul, does it die after your body dies? But it's also the death of everything that the spirit represents, whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's society, the way we know it, everything that it's about our identity as cultural beings. And I think that's also an incredibly important phase in that idea of farewell. Is the moment where the individual departs, also the moment where the collective ceases to exist. And somehow, of course, you could say that the ninth was his attempt to, let's say, struggle, first of all, with accepting that tonality is reaching its end, that Europe, in the way that he knew it, was reaching its end. It was very clear at the time that a big change was happening and that they were surfing the wave of an end of an era. And that the whole identity, what people defined themselves through, changed completely in that, around that very moment. And I have the feeling that the ninth was the transition piece into the acceptance of a new phase coming, which is why I call it the farewell from the spirit, because the spirit defined itself through new parameters. The 10th is for me the third, let's say, phase of farewell, and it's the farewell from the world in general. It's an apocalyptic piece. It's not anymore about us as individuals. It's not about our society. It's about the universe. And that's why I see the 10th Symphony as the third and last final step in this complete trilogy. And interestingly enough, again, with Mahler, always a long struggle. And at the end, there is like an epilogue, which is about once you've accepted the destiny of death in whatever form, there is transcendence that takes you on to the next step, which is very prominent in the 10th Symphony. When I did my very first concert in my life, I was, my first real concert of my own was with my own orchestra, which I founded when I was 18. And it was very important for me in that very first concert to play Mahler's Ninth Symphony. And of course, as a young conductor with a new ensemble and absolutely no funding, it was impossible to find all the musicians for that. And I did what many young conductors do, sometimes more and sometimes less successfully. I wrote an arrangement for a chamber orchestra of the last movement of Mahler's Ninth, because I said, this is for me the one piece of music that encompasses everything there is in life. And many people at the time questioned that and criticized me and said, well, but this is a piece that you only understand when you're old because it's about death and so on and so forth. And for me, it was always I rejected that notion so strongly. I said, no, it's not a piece about death, it's a piece about life, because that last movement of the ninth for me, contains the entire cycle of human existence, from birth to death. And in a way, then it goes backwards to where it started. In a way, the first two bars, just the violin motif of the last movement of the ninth, in themselves are for me like the DNA of the whole piece, and therefore in some way of human existence. So it was very important for me to I started my career with Mahler's Ninth, which many people see as a farewell piece, and me including myself. But at the same time, every farewell is also a new beginning, and that's why it was, for me, the piece that I felt I wanted to start with. And this brings me to what I wanted to talk about today, because every farewell is a new beginning is a topic that right now is important to all of us. And I'm talking now to musicians, to friends, to listeners, to whoever's listening right now, who shares with me the deep love that I feel towards music of all kind. And we've been through the most, let's say, shocking and the most, I would say, fundamental crisis this year that we've ever been through since we remember ourselves, at least as musicians or listeners. And this is it's a crisis that has shown so much. And again, I'm going to avoid any political discussions, but I'll just express my opinion on what we've seen, and a little, let's say, looking backwards on these last few months. We have lived in a way that was so privileged for so long. We never really assumed that anything of what we had could get lost. And there was so much that we had that we took for granted. And suddenly we realized, okay, all of those things are not necessarily things that happen by themselves. These are all big privileges. And I'll go back to that in a minute. Very often, when I do, let's say, an interview, or people ask me, why do you make music? And it's one of those horribly cliche questions that you can never really give an answer to, because whatever you'd say sounds stupid and doesn't really do the question justice. But yet there was one moment in my life which for me had an extremely strong impact. And sometimes you surely all know this when you let's say you watch a movie or you read a book that really changes your life. And I watched once a movie about another conductor. It's a Swedish movie called As It Is in Heaven. Maybe you all know it, maybe you don't. It's quite a kitschy movie, but I love kitsch, and I am get very, very sentimental. So and that movie really changed my life. And this conductor, who had a big burnout after a big career and goes up to this little village to conduct a choir, just before he dies at the end of the movie, he said, all I ever wanted to do is make music that opens people's hearts. And it sounds like such a sentimental and silly sentence, but it somehow had a huge impact on me, because I heard for the first time in my life, in one sentence, an explanation of what it is that has given me that incredible drive for all these years to go through so much hardship and to go through so much resistance to be able to make music. And I think and suddenly I understood this is actually the feeling of a mission that I had. I want to open people's hearts. And in a way, it would put it in a way slightly more, let's say a little bit more sophisticated, to say that my feeling is that music can bring people in contact with their own emotions in a way that nothing else can, which is also why I call this series When I Feel. It's about, for me, music is all about coming in contact with our emotions. It's about coming in contact with ourselves in a way. And ever since that movie, somehow that sentence has stuck to me as a sort of almost like a mantra or like a code that doesn't leave me every day when I wake up. And sometimes when we all have challenges and difficult moments, I remember this is why I'm doing this. Of course, I mean, in a way, any musician or artist who'd say, oh, I'm doing this for the others, would lie, because we all do it because first and foremost, we love it and we cannot live without it, and we need it for our own coming in contact with our own feelings. And that's an honest truth that some of us are happier to admit and others less so. But the fact is, we first of all can feel that we come in contact with our own selves more strongly than any other situation, and we need that like a drug. And in the second instance, we do it for other people to be able to experience the same. And this is what I think is the most important thing we need to think about these days, where I would say that the biggest challenge that we are facing next season, when hopefully music will start being played live again, is not the distance on stage between the musicians and whether we can play with a big orchestra or a small orchestra. It's not whether we can have an audience of 100 people or 50 people or 200 people, whether we can afford to have enough income from ticket sales so we can open. These are all very important, big questions that need to be tackled. And of course, when we see those full planes and those empty concert halls, we all go crazy. These are all important topics, but the one thing that we need to ask ourselves more than ever before is, why has it happened that nobody seems to mind enough that there's no music being played for the past 5 months? How come it's been that okay for the world that music, and let's say especially classical music, has just not been possible, and the world seems to be fine with that? And that's what I mean with that question is that I feel we have a duty to ask ourselves, have we become superfluous? Has music become something like sort of entertainment that people listen to have a good time? And that is the thing that I've been most worried about. I mean, of course, it's hugely important that governments support freelance musicians so they're able to just financially survive this crisis. Of course, it's hugely important that we fix this incredible injustice of why people can fly in full planes and at the same time we're not allowed to play music in a concert hall. But I'm sure we will fix those problems, but we will not fix the main problem, that is that people would go into the streets to protest that there's no football or that there's no restaurants, but they would not go to the streets to protest that there's no music. And that, because I do believe that music is probably one of the most fundamental, and art in general, the most fundamental, not only needs, but rights of humans, and also the reason for which we exist in a way, to come in contact with our own feelings through that and to reach this form of spiritual transcendence. I have to always think of the sentence that the quote of Leonard Bernstein, who said, to the topic of violence, this will be a reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devotedly than ever before. And surely you could say it's very naive to quote that in this setting, but I think we need to take this summer break and ask ourselves, what has been missing in our music making for the past few years that the world can live without it? And how can we make music in the most intense and the most fundamental and existential way that the world will not be able to even imagine a situation where there's no music? Because when that happens, all the other problems will find a way to be solved. But we need to find a way for the music that we make to bring people so strongly to their own emotions that they will not even be able to live in a world where this music does not happen. And music, as we know, only happens live. And we need to make sure that everybody feels. It's not about understanding. It's not about teaching people ideas. It's not about trying to educate people that culture is important. We should go away from this whole idea of educating people or of showing people what is right. It's about people feeling the need to experience music live in a concert hall and not being able to live without it. So I think when I first started this series, I wanted to call today's episode Incomplete. And in a way, I think that I now change it to complete, because I think probably when I conduct Mahler's Ninth Symphony, I feel more complete than in any other situation in my life. And I think many of my listeners and many of the players that I've been fortunate to make music with when conducting this symphony, by now many times, which I'm very grateful for, hopefully many times in the future, is the feeling that on that moment, my spirit and my body and my emotions are so connected. I'm so close to myself in a way that is not possible in any other situation, which is why probably complete is a better description for this episode than incomplete. And I really hope that we all take the time in the summer, and it doesn't matter whether we're listeners, we are players, we are conductors, we are presenters. All of us are equally crucial elements in this world of music that is there to give society an identity and a place which connects people to their own feelings, and find a way to come back after this crisis, because again, every farewell is also a beginning. So I'm back to my idea of a cycle, and use this huge crisis as the biggest chance we've ever had in the past 30, 40, 50 years to ask ourselves, why are we making music? I mean, it cannot be that music just becomes a job, or it becomes a form of making a living, or a form of entertainment for people that are affluent or have a social status. Music has to be an existential need to listen to as well as make it, like oxygen, like water, and come out of this crisis and make music in a way that is so existential that nobody could ever imagine a world where it doesn't exist. And I think this is what I feel when I conduct Mahler's Ninth Symphony. Thank you so much for having followed me since April in these very unusual times. I will definitely be back next season, probably not as regularly, because hopefully I can make music again, which is something I'm a lot better at than talking. And I hope you will join me in some of my concerts, but I will definitely be back from time to time in this format. And I hope to see you all soon in a world where music is a necessity, not a luxury. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good summer.